Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at action research in this online lecture and get us ready for some applied use of the ideas in the tutorial. So action research is a very practical orientation towards curriculum design and particularly development, so it improves over time. So the whole idea with action research is that constant, ongoing and systematic improvement in what we're offering to students. So let's begin with what we're going to look at. So we're going to look at the learning outcome 2 about identifying issues with courses and devising, implementing and evaluating solutions, because action research very much unearths certainly what's good and strong and helps consolidate that and identifies weaknesses and has a process to improve those weak elements and make them stronger, but also continue to go on and find out what's happening as you do the ongoing evaluation. So action research is a cycle of action and research, finding out what's going on. So it's research for the sake of action. So what we'll do today in this lecture is consider the role of problem identification for curriculum development. We'll use the skills of action research for curriculum improvement, especially when we get to the tutorial, and relate action research to the learning issue that you've identified for assignment 4. So whether that issue is to do with the problems of the article in English language learning, or it's to do with particular difficulties of a musical instrument for young students. What issue you've found, you can think of it from the perspective of action research to improve the way you're approaching teaching around that issue. So it's good to situate action research from the perspective of all education research methodologies. So very simple overview of that is we have action research on the left and experimental research on the right. And experimental research is where you have, for example, randomized controlled trials, and you have researchers coming in to have very specific and prescribed set elements. Between action research and experimental research, you have other methodologies that are somewhere along that whole spectrum. Participant observation, mixed methods, or quasi-experimental, that move from the action research side through to the experimental research side. So action research is minimally controlled or contrived. It's what teachers do, and they don't have additional resources or additional people in the classroom. It's part of a normal teaching role, but it just has an intention and a process behind it. But experimental research is highly controlled and contrived. You have extra funding, typically researchers coming in, people looking at things either experimentally will usually generate numbers and have tried to go for large numbers of students, multiple classes, interventions. And so one of the advantages for action research for us is it's within our powers of teachers to have an influence on the curriculum. Whereas experimental research, we can learn from it, it's hard to be directly engaging in it. So there is a continuum from those things with the other methodologies fitting on that. So action research is very natural to the classroom, maximally naturalistic. So because it involves what we do, it doesn't have a big influence on students' change in behaviours. Whereas you could say that experimental research has an element which is minimally naturalistic, and it's a bit of a foreign intervention and can affect students in quite unexpected ways that are additional to the actual treatment being tried. There's a continuum for that. And experimental research, what is valued is it's maximally generalizable. So say, well, if it worked here, it should work anywhere else because we've controlled all the variables. Now, of course, that sounds great, except it's very difficult to have genuinely randomised controlled trials in education. There's all sorts of ethical implications, there's implications of timetabling, and it's hard to run things over a sustained period of time, so they're usually short and almost educationally insignificant. So in the search for generalisability, we can lose quite a lot in reality, and things in education tend to be more quasi-experimental, one back down the line, or mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative approaches, and then things get much more complex in all the variables and what they're confounding. So in action research, by knowing that you are strongly influencing the environment, because it's very natural, it's part of your daily work, but also it can be maximally transferable, where teachers can tell other teachers about what they do, and other teachers can think, oh, I could adapt that and apply it to my context. So it's not generalizable, but a different criteria is to say, I could generalize if I understand what you've done in your context. I could think about it for my context and my students. So, because we're thinking about ongoing curriculum development, what action research shapes like is you can draw on different data sets for action research. That's your own reflection on the process to improve what's going on. You can also think of the data set that's influenced by colleagues and peer review and people observing classes or revising documents. You can also come at it from this perspective of students, and not just student evaluations, but observations, anecdotal conversations you have with students, their assessment results, and the marking you do gives you a lot of information about students. And finally, the last one is going to be concepts or literature. So models like Bloom's taxonomy or MELT that we've been using, or any number of the models that you've used, like in your assignment 2 and 3, could be concepts like flipped classroom design, could be evaluation frameworks. All those things influence and forms of perspective on our curriculum in the classroom. And this is 4 sides of a square pyramid, but all square pyramids actually have a hidden 5th side. It's on the bottom, it's not revealed, but it's foundational. And if you pull all these data sets together, then you can hold them all in place, make them secure and sound and beautiful with a firm foundation of action research. And really, that's drawing the whole pyramid together to be a way, an approach of looking at things from all these different angles, students, colleagues, concepts, literature, and your own self-reflection, to provide you with information, data, to make decisions on how to improve your curriculum. And also how to identify problems so that you can begin to think about how to improve. So these are the 5 different surfaces we're going to think about for action research, with its square base and the other triangles. So if we're thinking about real teaching and curriculum, if you've got a teaching problem, and a problem with teaching is that the status of a problem is not the same as in research. In research, having a problem is right at the heart of the investigative process. It's the compound of generative questions around which all creative and productive activity revolves, meaning that if you've got a problem, you think, there's something strange here, I can research that. So it's exciting. But the same is not the case in one's teaching. A problem is something you don't want to have. And if you have one, you should probably want to fix it and maybe even hide it and not tell people. So there's quite a different status. what we're saying here is that we want to not hide the problem, unearth it, bring it to the surface, and make it visible, and start to deal with it in very thorough curriculum improving ways. We want to action research it. So the Pentagon we've used for curriculum design brainstorm, or curriculum brainstorm Pentagon. That shape was actually developed first by engineering students, this Pentagon within a Pentagon. And in fact, they designed it as the problem-solving Pentagon. And they put at the center problem definition and specification. And as you know, we have used this shape, but we've kept the more general idea where at the center is to embark and clarify. And there's many ways of doing that. For action research, it is often problem identification. So first, what I mean by action research is where teachers, such as you and me, intentionally enhance the conditions for learning through spirals of action and improvement in contexts for which they have direct responsibility. So what that means is we're actually purposefully making better situations for learning with whole cycles of action and improvement. But particularly where we're in charge, we have responsibility. At a class we teach, or a course we coordinate, or a program we direct. Where we have direct responsibility, that's in the realm of action research, because it's going to improve the learning for something we have control over, to some extent. So if you reframe the more general model of MELT, models of engaged learning and teaching, we could call it an action research Pentagon. In addition to the curriculum brainstorm Pentagon, we have used it as before. So let's unpack that particular framework. So as a curriculum action research, CARP, what we're really thinking about is revisiting the same skills for the action research, but what we're trying to do is apply it in different contexts with increasing degree and conceptual demand, so that what that looks like is for the students under our care and for us as action researchers. If I just control my iPad, you have a skill set that's true to MELT, and as you visit and revisit, the skill set spirals around and becomes richer and stronger and more powerful, more deeply understood, and more empowering for student learning. So we want to have this spiraling, ongoing relationship in action research for improvement, so things get better. So the facets of action research that you know from previous discussions of MELT, we have to begin somewhere, and often it's not just a beginning, but it's a re-beginning. We have to find information or generate data that's relevant to how we've begun, to evaluate and reflect on the process. So evaluate data and reflect on the process. We have to organise the information we have, and it might be numbers, it might be words, it might be visual, it might be all sorts of observations. To organise that and manage our action research process, which as teachers implementing a curriculum is not easy. There's a lot of time pressures, and you probably don't want to focus on too much more than one course at a time. You have to analyse so you can see from that data what are the new problems emerging, and synthesise things so you develop an understanding of what's happening, and communicate and apply, and communicate often to a colleague next door or to the students in the class or the next class, and then that communication can go much further afield, as we'll see. So like with the curriculum brainstorm, when in doubt, go to the centre. embark and clarify. What are you trying to do? What's the problem you're solving? And are you actually solving that problem in the whole process? So the action research process then becomes that you want to identify a problem or articulate a question, find a solution, because there might be one that could exist, or generate a solution. You want to evaluate others, things like solutions and sources, or evaluate your own. Organise the implementation and with all the management issues and time. We want to analyse the data that emerges and synthesise it into fresh understandings, and communicate and apply findings to different audiences depending on what's going on. For identification of problems, you might start quite simply with action research. You might use one of those reflective surfaces in the pyramid, like student evaluation or students' scores in tests, or you might use multiple. So you could bring in colleagues' perspective, literature perspective, self-reflection. And so with action research, you can start small and contained and make it grow bigger and more rigorous over time. In terms of find and generate, you can just imagine potential solutions first, and you become increasingly scholarly over time to add in more ideas from the literature and what other people have done and what could be done. So you want to evaluate sources, at least at the level, are they appropriate for the task? Are they, are those ideas relevant to what you're doing? But you want to head and more think about how credible are these ideas? What's the evidence base? And how commonly are other people using them and evaluating them? For organisation and management, you want to start small and just with one course, one class, one tutorial. But over time, you might explore it with additional classes, maybe other colleagues, and let it grow over time, but no rush. For analysis, you might start with very anecdotal evidence and analyse that, and move to qualitative or quantitative and the analysis of that, and then eventually bring together the qualitative and quantitative, and in that synthesis of what's going on, form deeper a sense of understanding and trends or themes. And then to communicate your findings, starting, as I said, to a class, but then you might go beyond the class to colleagues, to school, and you might even start to present at educational conferences. And that's something you can work towards, no rush. You can build up the growth of things in action research over time. Then you fine-tune your question. You don't have to start with a question and then stick to it. You're often changing it over time to fit your learning, and new things emerge. So we must make sure that when we embark and clarify, we head in that direction, but then we're using the other facets and learning to actually guide what's going on. So, as I said, we can identify the problem with anecdotally with colleagues. You could also use pre-test, find out what students are like beforehand with a diagnostic. You can have the formative assessment, because that's giving them feedback for improvement, but you also got evidence of how they're performing. And of course, summative assessment is a great way for students in a previous course, how they're coping for a new course, or there's a range of ways we could use summative assessment for identifying problems. Evaluation of course or program, whether that's focus groups or CELT data, things like that. And a whole review, of course, where you get external people in to look over things. All these ways can be helping us identify problems. Of course, drawing on the literature at relevant points, and increasingly so, to add the rigour and sophistication of what's going on in your country or around the world, that helps us understand what the problems are. And that's what I've asked in assignment 4, is that you choose something that's almost anecdotal, an issue of concern that you've seen, whether as a teacher or as a student, and then also look in the literature for that issue and find out how many others, well, not how many, but that others have had that problem. And so you've got your own basis and the literature to say why you're looking at this issue in your curriculum design. So when it comes to find and generate, of course, what you can draw on to devise solutions is start simple with your imagination, and then it builds in rigor, collegial conversations, suggestions from evaluations, from student evaluations, recommendations from others reviewing your course, again from the literature, of course, and the synthesis, your own synthesis of the literature. And then, when we've got that ideas of potential solutions, we want to, in the implementation, think about the evaluation and as well reflect on the whole process. So, of the solutions, which one would you actually trial first? Because you might have multiple versions. What criteria would you use for selecting the solution? So those are some of the evaluation questions you can ask first, and then later on, another set of evaluation questions as you spiral through about the actual implementation. For organise and manage, when you're implementing the solution, so you start off small, maybe just if you've got a lot of tutorials, one out of the 8, or if you've got 5 year 4 classes, just your class, and then you can increase over time. So we can have short-term trials, and we could, for example, trial problem-based learning in the last few weeks, see how that's going. But increase in size and time as you grow in your expertise and understanding and fine-tuning of the question, knowing what you're looking for, you can grow. So you can involve colleagues and bring them in and have them as part of the conversation, evaluation, but also implementing as well. So you're really growing the whole thing in your school. Sorry about the slowness here. And then, of course, you can go broader to thinking outside of that, and at conferences, presenting and getting feedback on ideas, things like that. Then that's where you need to really think about evaluation heavily again. So this is not a linear process. So to evaluate the implementation and the data you've gathered, again, anecdotal. How many students reached a prescribed criteria is often an important evaluation strategy. The SELT data, interviews, if you can have focus groups or interviews with individual students, is good. And so you might use qualitative and quantitative data together to give you deep understandings, also called mixed methods research. And then into the analysis and synthesis, where you really want to make sense of all that's going on and all the themes and all the trends that are happening. And where in the analysis and the synthesis, the analysis shows you the trends and the themes that are happening. It's so important, where you understand how the curriculum is working, what it's doing. And you synthesize really two things. One is what to keep and what to improve, or what to remove. You come up with an understanding based on all that data on the implementation of what's worth it, and new cycles of action as you simultaneously communicate to all those audiences I mentioned before, starting with students, so they know what's going on, And students often appreciate a teacher involved in a process for curriculum improvement and applying the things they're learning directly, straight away. So that gives you an overview of curriculum action research in terms of the 6 facets of MELT. And what we'll do in the tutorial is think about the application of curriculum action research for your curriculum. So what does it mean in the context, yes, of your assignment 4, but of your teaching more broadly? We'll put those things into action, and of course that will be in the online environment. So I look forward to seeing you next week in Zoom again. Okay, so we'll until next week, we'll see you then.